Hi, my name is Keith Watkins, and I'm a federal district judge for the Middle District of Alabama, located in Montgomery, Alabama. And I want to talk to you today a little bit about the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Since we're talking about the Constitution, I put on my Constitution tie. You see the Liberty Bell here, and that's in commemoration of the 19th Amendment, which was passed 100 years ago this year, which was adopted, rather, 100 years ago this year. I'm going to start with a story. You've all probably heard of thousands of years ago a rabbi who had presented to him by a bunch of men a woman. They dragged her to the rabbi, saying that they had caught her in the act of adultery, in the very act of adultery, and that according to their law, she should be stoned. Well, the rabbi bent down on the ground, and he was being called upon to make a decision about the fate of this woman. And so he scratched some words on the ground, which were not recorded. I suspect those words might have been, "Where is the man?" There was no man, there was just the woman. And these men were dragging her to be stoned to death in accordance with the law. And of course the rabbi said, "He who is without sin, let him cast the first stone." And the men who had brought her to the rabbi, beginning with the oldest first and down to the youngest, dropped their stones and walked away. And the rabbi said to the woman, "Does anyone condemn you?" She said, "No." And he said, "Go and sin no more." Why was the woman brought to the rabbi to be punished and the man was not? Well, that's because, unfortunately, throughout history, men have had, and cultures have had, a lesser vision of a woman and her rights. Some cultures have treated women as property in history. Some have treated them as worse than property, something to be owned, like a horse or a wagon. Even up until the 20th century, some cultures in this world didn't even give little girls names when they were born. Boys were more valued because they could work on farms generally and were more valuable to their parents than girls were. So in some cultures, until into the 20th century, girls were not even given names when they were born. Well, that all changed lately in the last 100 years, at least in the United States and maybe in most nations of the world. And one of those rights that women were denied for so many years, even in our country, was the right to vote. Now, when our Constitution was adopted in 1789, or ratified in 1789, the Bill of Rights contained a listing of the most important rights for American citizens. And guess what was not in there? What was not in there was the right to vote. Well, we recognize it today as one of our most important rights to run a democracy. And I don't know whether it was just assumed by the founders that it was a right that the states would protect, or whether there was some suspicion about common people voting. You see, the Constitution left it up to the states to decide who was qualified to vote. The original Constitution did. And most states restricted that to white males who owned property or paid taxes. It was different in every state of the Union when the Constitution was adopted. But those were generally the requirements. And guess what percentage of the population thus was entitled to vote? About 6%. Well, that excluded, of course, women and people of color and others. And so let's jump forward to the Civil War, at which time most of the property restrictions had been removed in most states, but there were still 5 states that had that restriction. But after the war, the 14th Amendment was adopted, and it still made reference to male citizens and their right to vote. Women could not vote. In fact, it was not until 1869 the state of Wyoming adopted the right of women to vote in state elections. The reason Wyoming did it and a lot of western states did it is, guess what? They wanted population. And so one way to get population was to give women rights that would get them to move to Wyoming and other states. In 1919, the suffrage movement, which I'll explain in a moment, at least that word, and the suffrage movement eventually led, after 50 years, to the 19th Amendment to the Constitution being adopted. And it's very simple. And it's two sentences, the amendment is. And this is the amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The appropriate number of states adopted that constitutional amendment in 1920, and so that became the law of the land, and women could vote. Let's talk about the word suffrage. Suffrage comes from the Latin root that means to vote or to count. So it was called a suffrage movement. It has nothing to do with suffering, unless, of course, the wrong person is elected. There might be some suffering. But suffrage, it has nothing to do with suffering. Sometimes the word used is, vote is referred to as the franchise. The franchise then is used to say when a person is disqualified to vote, they are disfranchised or disenfranchised is the way the law addresses that. Of course, there are a lot of other voting rights that have become issues in the law, and the United States Constitution and the Supreme Court of the United States have begun to get more into the area of voting rights, and today it is one of our premier rights, and there's a lot of interest in protecting that right for a broad number of people to vote as citizens in the United States. Sometimes cultural changes or historical changes result in a change in the law. The 26th Amendment was adopted in 1971 because of a war. Many states restricted the vote to persons who were 21 years or older. Yet an 18-year-old could be drafted and sent to Vietnam or other places in the world to fight. This is when I was in college, and it was widely thought that if you're old enough to fight, you should be old enough to vote. So the 26th Amendment to the Constitution guaranteed voting rights for persons 18 years and older in the United States, and it's because of the Vietnam War. Those are just some interesting side bits about voting in the United States. But this year on Law Day, which is May the 1st, decreed by President Eisenhower in 1958 when I was in the second grade. Law Day is May the 1st in the United States, and this year we commemorate the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, guaranteeing the right of women to vote in the United States.